The needle slipped through Penelope's thumb for the third time that morning, and she did not even flinch as blood welled up on the pad of her finger. She had grown accustomed to the darkness of her rented room above the general store in Carlin, Nevada, where shadows pooled in every corner even at midday. The single window facing the alley had been boarded up by the previous tenant, and the landlord refused to repair it. So she stitched by candlelight, squinting until her eyes burned and her head throbbed, because the miners and their families needed clothes mended and she needed to eat. It was 1878, and Carlin had sprung up along the Central Pacific Railroad like a weed pushing through rock. The town existed to serve the railroad and the silver mines that dotted the surrounding hills, and most folks passing through never stayed long enough to notice the seamstress working in the dark above the general store. Penelope had arrived 6 months ago from Sacramento after her father died, leaving her with nothing but debts and a trunk full of sewing supplies. She was 22 years old and determined to make her own way, even if it meant ruining her eyesight one stitch at a time. The knock on her door came just after noon, heavy and deliberate. Penelope set down the trousers she had been hemming and wiped the blood from her thumb before answering. She expected Mrs. Henderson coming to collect her husband's shirts, or perhaps young Billy from the telegraph office with another rush order. She did not expect the man who filled her doorway like a mountain. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly brushed both sides of the frame. His hair fell past his collar in dark waves, and his beard was trimmed close enough to show the strong line of his jaw. His arms strained against the fabric of his shirt, muscles clearly defined even through the worn cotton. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and hard living in the wilderness. His eyes, a startling shade of gray like storm clouds over the Sierra Nevada, swept across her cramped room and stopped on her face. "You are the seamstress," he said. It was not a question. "I am, Penelope Durant." "What can I do for you, Mr. Tanner Frost?" His voice was deep and rough like gravel shifting underfoot. "I need a shirt, too, if you can manage it. My old ones are more whole than fabric." Penelope nodded and gestured for him to enter, though there was precious little room for a man of his size. He had to duck to clear the door frame, and when he stood inside, the space seemed to shrink around him. She fumbled for her measuring tape, acutely aware of how close they stood in the gloom. "I will need to take measurements," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. He nodded and stood still as she worked, though she could feel the tension in him, as if standing indoors went against his nature. When she wrapped the tape around his chest, she was startled by the sheer breadth of him. His arms were thick with muscle, his shoulders impossibly wide. She had never measured a man built quite like this. "You live up in the Ruby Mountains?" she asked, making conversation to ease her own nervousness. "I do. About 15 miles northeast. I trap and hunt, bring pelts and meat into town once a month. That must be lonely work. I prefer the quiet." He watched her as she noted his measurements in her ledger. "How do you see to work in here?" "It is dark as a cave." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I manage well enough. The landlord will not fix the window, and I cannot afford to move." Tanner said nothing, but his gray eyes narrowed as he looked around the room again, taking in the candle stubs burned down to nothing, the way she had positioned her work table to catch whatever meager light seeped under the door. His jaw tightened. "How much for 2 shirts?" he asked. She named her price, and he counted out the money from a leather pouch without haggling. Most customers tried to talk her down, but Tanner simply placed the coins in her palm and closed her fingers around them with his own much larger hand. "I will return in a week," he said. After he left, the room seemed even smaller and darker than before. Penelope stood holding the coins, feeling the warmth his hand had left behind, and wondered why her heart was beating so fast. 2 days later, she woke to the sound of hammering. Penelope sat up in her narrow bed, disoriented, as morning light streamed across her floor in a way it never had before. She scrambled up, clutching her nightgown around her, and stared in disbelief at the wall where the boarded window had been. Tanner stood on a ladder outside, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the early hour, installing a proper glass window. He had removed all the old boards and cleaned away years of grime. Sunlight poured into her room, bright and beautiful and almost painful after so many months of darkness. Penelope rushed to pull on her dress and ran downstairs, not even bothering with her boots. She found Tanner descending the ladder, a hammer tucked into his belt. Up close, she could see the way his muscles moved beneath his skin, the strength in his forearms as he gripped the ladder. "What have you done?" she demanded, though it came out more bewildered than angry. "You needed a window. But I did not ask you to. I cannot pay you for this." Tanner picked up a second window frame that leaned against the building. "I did not ask for payment. You work in the dark all day." "That is wrong. I do not need charity, Mr. Frost. It is not charity." He looked at her directly, those gray eyes steady and serious. "Consider it a trade. You are making my shirts. I am making sure you can see to do it properly." Before she could argue further, he was climbing the ladder again. Penelope stood in the alley, torn between pride and gratitude, watching him work. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his hands sure and skilled. She noticed he had brought not one but 3 window frames, and he spent the entire day installing them, creating a wall of glass that would catch the southern sun. The landlord came by mid-morning, sputtering about property modifications, but Tanner climbed down and stood at his full height, and the landlord suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Mrs. Chen from the laundry brought Tanner lunch, her eyes twinkling as she glanced between him and Penelope. By afternoon, half the town had found a reason to walk past the general store and gawk at the mountain man installing windows for the seamstress. When the sun began to set, Tanner cleaned up the broken boards and smoothed out the rough patches with sandpaper he had brought. Penelope had gone back upstairs hours ago, but she could not focus on her work. She kept looking at the windows, at the way light filled every corner of her room, chasing away the shadows that had been her constant companions. When Tanner finally knocked on her door, she answered immediately. "It is done," he said simply. Penelope looked past him at the 3 large windows now gracing her wall. The evening light came through golden and warm. She could see the mountains in the distance, the street below, the vast Nevada sky. "Why did you do this?" she asked quietly. Tanner was silent for a long moment. "I lived in the dark once. Years ago, after my family died, I holed up in a cabin with no windows, no light. I thought I wanted to shut out the world. Nearly drove me mad." He met her eyes. "Nobody should have to work in the dark like that, not if someone can do something about it." "Thank you," Penelope said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I do not know how to repay you." "Make good shirts," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that might have been a smile. After he left, Penelope stood at her new windows and watched him walk toward the edge of town where his horse was tethered. Even in the fading light, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the confident way he moved. Something had shifted inside her, like a window opening in a room she had kept locked. The next morning, Penelope woke with the sun for the first time in months. She lay in bed, watching the light creep across her floor, and felt tears slip down her temples. She had not realized how much the darkness had been weighing on her until it was gone. The room looked different in daylight, larger and cleaner. She could see dust motes dancing in the air, the true color of the faded wallpaper, the detail in the fabric she had been stitching blind. She threw herself into making Tanner's shirts with a fervor that surprised her. She chose the best fabric she had, a sturdy dark blue cotton that would wear well and match his eyes. She reinforced every seam, made the shoulders extra broad, and took special care with the buttons. At night, she would pause in her work and look out the windows at the stars, thinking about the man who had given her back the light. When Tanner returned a week later, she had the shirts wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. She also had a basket packed with fresh bread, cheese, and dried apples. "The shirts are ready," she said when she opened the door. He took the package and unwrapped it, examining her work with careful attention. He ran his fingers over the seams, tested the buttons, held the fabric up to the window light. "These are fine shirts, better than anything I have owned. They should be. I could actually see what I was doing." She held out the basket. "And this is for you." To say thank you properly for the windows. Tanner looked at the basket, then at her. "You did not need to do this. You did not need to install 3 windows, but you did." She pushed the basket into his hands. "Take it, please." He accepted it, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Penelope felt that touch like a spark. "Will you sit for a moment?" she found herself asking. "I could make coffee." Tanner hesitated, and she thought he would refuse, but then he nodded. "All right." They sat at her small table by the windows, drinking coffee that Penelope made on her tiny stove. It felt surreal, having this large, quiet man in her space, his knees barely fitting under the table, but it also felt right in a way she could not explain. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" she asked. 8 years. I came west after the war. My parents and sister died of fever while I was gone. When I came back, there was nothing left for me in Missouri, so I kept moving until I found a place where I could breathe." "I am sorry about your family," he nodded, accepting her sympathy. "What brought you to Carlin?" "My father died last winter. He owed more than he owned. I had to sell everything just to cover his debts. I had some skill with a needle, and I heard they needed a seamstress here." She looked out the window at the dusty street below. "It is not what I imagined my life would be, but it is mine." "That counts for something," Tanner said. "Making your own way." They talked until the coffee grew cold, and Penelope was surprised by how easy it was to speak with him. He did not say much, but when he did, his words had weight. He listened intently, watching her face as she spoke, and she found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone else in town. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "I come to town every few weeks for supplies. Would it be all right if I stopped by?" "To see how the windows are holding up," Penelope smiled. "I think that would be fine." After that, Tanner became a regular visitor. He would arrive in Carlin on his bay horse, a magnificent animal nearly as large as he was, and after conducting his business, he would climb the stairs to Penelope's room. Sometimes he brought her things from the mountains: wildflowers in the spring, pine cones, interesting stones. Once he brought her a piece of antler shed by an elk, smooth and white as bone. "For your table," he said, setting it down. "So you remember there is more out there than this town." Penelope picked it up, running her fingers over the cool surface. "Will you tell me about it? The mountains, I mean." So Tanner told her about the high country, about meadows filled with lupine and Indian paintbrush, about crystal streams where trout leaped in the morning light. He described the way snow clung to the peaks even in summer, and how the aspens turned gold in fall, and how the silence up there was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. "It sounds beautiful," Penelope said wistfully. "It is. You should see it sometime." "Women do not just go wandering into the wilderness. They do if someone takes them." He met her eyes. I could show you if you wanted. There is a place about 5 miles from here, an easy ride. Meadow full of flowers right now. Penelope's heart skipped. That would not be proper. An unmarried woman, alone with a man. We would not be alone. Half the town watches every time I come here anyway. He had a point. Mrs. Chen and the others had been gossiping about them for weeks. But if you are not comfortable, I understand. Penelope thought about her dark room, about the months she had spent squinting over her needle by candlelight, about how Tanner had seen her struggling and had done something about it, asking nothing in return. She thought about how her heart lifted every time she saw him coming down the street, how the days between his visits stretched long and empty. I would like to see the meadow, she said. They went on Sunday, when most of the town was at church. Tanner arrived with his bay horse and a smaller chestnut mare he had borrowed from the livery. He helped Penelope mount, his large hand steadying her, and then they rode out of Carlin as the sun climbed higher. The mountains rose around them, sagebrush giving way to juniper and then pine. The air smelled clean and sharp, nothing like the dust and coal smoke of town. Tanner rode slightly ahead, but he kept looking back to make sure she was all right, and Penelope found herself watching the way he sat his horse, the easy confidence of a man completely at home in the wild. The meadow was everything he had promised. It spread out before them like a carpet of color, purple lupine and red paintbrush and yellow mule ears all mixed together. A stream ran through the middle, sparkling over smooth stones. The mountains ringed them on all sides, and overhead the sky was a blue so deep it hurt to look at. They dismounted, and Tanner unpacked a blanket and the lunch Penelope had made. They sat in the shade of a large pine, eating bread and cheese and watching the horses graze. "This is the most beautiful place I have ever seen," Penelope said. "I thought you might like it." Tanner lay back on the blanket, his hands behind his head. "I come here sometimes when I need to think. What do you think about? The future. What I want my life to be." He turned his head to look at her. "Used to be I thought I wanted to be alone forever. Now I am not so sure." Penelope's breath caught. She looked down at her hands, her pulse racing. "What changed?" "I met a woman who works too hard in the dark. Who is brave enough to make her own way in a hard town. Who smiles when light comes through a window like it is the first sunrise she has ever seen." Tanner. His name came out as barely a whisper. He sat up, and suddenly he was very close, his gray eyes searching her face. "I know I am not much. I live in a cabin in the woods. I have dirt under my nails and I smell like pine smoke. But I cannot stop thinking about you, Penelope. Have not stopped since the day I walked into your dark room. You are everything," she said, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might break. But when Penelope wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him closer, he deepened the kiss, one hand coming up to cup her face. He was so strong, all hard muscle and controlled power, but he touched her like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, Penelope was breathing hard. Tanner rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you will have me." "Yes," Penelope said. "Yes, I will have you." They rode back to Carlin in the late afternoon, and if anyone noticed the way Tanner helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist, or the way Penelope blushed and smiled, they kept it to themselves. But by the next morning, the whole town knew that the mountain man and the seamstress were courting. Over the following weeks, Tanner came to town more frequently. He would help Penelope with heavy work, fetching water from the well, carrying coal for her stove. He repaired the loose floorboard by her bed and oiled the hinges on her door. The other men in town watched with a mixture of respect and envy as this silent giant doted on the quiet seamstress. Penelope had never been happier. She would work during the day, and when she grew tired, she would look up at the windows Tanner had built for her and remember why he had done it. In the evenings, they would walk together through town or sit by her windows and talk until the stars came out. He told her more about his life, about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the war that had taken so much from him. She told him about her childhood in Sacramento, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about her father's slow decline after that. "We have both lost so much," Penelope said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "Yes," Tanner agreed, "but maybe we found each other because of it. Maybe loss taught us to recognize something worth keeping." He started bringing her small gifts carved from wood: a robin, a horse, a tiny perfect rose. His hands, so large and rough, could create the most delicate things. Penelope kept them on the windowsill where the light would catch them. One evening in early summer, Tanner arrived looking troubled. Penelope knew him well enough now to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set. "What is wrong?" she asked. "I need to go up into the high country for a few weeks. There is good trapping up there this time of year, and I need to build up my stores for winter." He took her hands in his. "I do not want to leave you, but I have to make a living. Of course you do, I understand. I will be back as soon as I can. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I will be here." He pulled her close, wrapping her in his arms. Penelope pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of pine and leather and something uniquely him. She had never felt so safe as she did in his embrace. "I am going to marry you, Penelope Durant," he said into her hair. "When I come back, I am going to ask you properly with a ring and everything. But I needed you to know that. I love you." Penelope pulled back to look up at him, tears in her eyes. "I love you too. I think I have since you brought the light back into my life." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Penelope melted into him. When they finally parted, both of them were breathing hard. 3 weeks, he promised. Then we start our life together. But Tanner did not return in 3 weeks. 4 weeks passed, then 5, and Penelope grew frantic with worry. She asked everyone who came through town if they had seen a large man trapping in the Ruby Mountains, but no one had news. The summer heat beat down on Carlin, and Penelope worked mechanically, her mind always on Tanner. What if something had happened to him? The mountains were dangerous. There were bears, mountain lions, treacherous trails. He could have fallen, broken a leg where no one would find him. He could be lying hurt somewhere, calling for help that would never come. 6 weeks after he left, Penelope made a decision. She could not just sit and wait anymore. She would go looking for him herself. She packed supplies, put on her sturdiest dress and boots, and went to the livery. Old Tom, who ran it, tried to talk her out of it. "Miss Durant, you cannot just go riding into the mountains alone. It is not safe." "Then someone should come with me. Tanner might be hurt. He might need help." "The mountain man can take care of himself. He probably just got delayed." "For 6 weeks? No, something is wrong. I can feel it." She met Tom's eyes steadily. "I am going. You can either rent me a horse or I will walk." Tom sighed and shook his head, but he saddled the chestnut mare for her. "At least take the main trail, and if you are not back by tomorrow night, I am sending someone after you." Penelope rode out of Carlin with the sun high overhead, following the trail Tanner always took toward the northeast. She had never been further than the meadow he had shown her, but she remembered him saying his cabin was 15 miles out, near a distinctive rock formation that looked like a broken tooth. The afternoon wore on. The trail climbed higher into the mountains, winding through pine forest and across rocky streams. Penelope's legs ached from gripping the saddle, and fear gnawed at her belly. What if she could not find him? What if she got lost herself? But then, as the sun began to sink toward the peaks, she saw it. a spire of granite rising above the trees, broken at the top like a shattered tooth. She urged the mare forward, her heart pounding. The cabin sat in a clearing below the rock formation, a sturdy structure built from logs with a stone chimney. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Penelope nearly sobbed with relief. He was here. He was alive. She slid off the mare and ran to the door, pounding on it. "Tanner, Tanner, it is me." The door swung open, and there he was, but not as she had last seen him. His face was haggard and pale, and he leaned heavily on a crutch. His left leg was wrapped in bandages from thigh to ankle. "Penelope," he stared at her as if she was a mirage. "What are you doing here? How did you?" "You did not come back. I thought something had happened to you." She could not stop looking at his leg. "What happened?" "Rockslide caught my leg. It has been broken for 4 weeks." He pulled her inside and shut the door, then lowered himself carefully into a chair. "I have been trying to heal enough to ride back to town. I should have sent someone with word, but there has been no one up here." The cabin was neat but sparse. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace. Pelts hung from the rafters, and supplies were stacked along one wall. Penelope could see he had been managing as best he could, but he looked exhausted and in pain. "Let me see," she said, kneeling beside him. Tanner unwrapped the bandages, and Penelope had to steel herself not to gasp. The leg was badly bruised, swollen, though it looked like the bone had been set properly. "Did you do this yourself?" "I did not have much choice. You could have died up here. I knew the risks." He touched her face gently. "But you should not have come. The mountains are dangerous, especially alone. So is sitting in town wondering if the man you love is lying dead somewhere." Penelope stood. "I am staying until you are well enough to travel, and do not argue with me." A smile tugged at his mouth despite the pain. "I would not dare." Penelope spent the next 3 days caring for Tanner. She made him food, changed his bandages, forced him to rest even when he protested that there was work to be done. At night, she slept in his bed while he insisted on taking the floor, though she argued that was ridiculous given his injury. "My mother raised me to be a gentleman," he said stubbornly. "A lady gets the bed." On the 4th day, Penelope woke to find Tanner up and moving around the cabin, testing his weight on the injured leg. It was still weak, but he could walk on it with care. "I think I can manage the ride to town," he said, "if we go slow." They packed up what he would need and set out in the morning. Tanner rode his big bay carefully, his jaw tight with pain, and Penelope stayed close beside him. The journey that had taken her a few hours took them the better part of a day, but finally Carlin came into view as the sun set. Old Tom met them at the livery, relief written all over his face. "Thank the Lord. When you did not come back, Miss Durrant, I thought we had lost both of you." Word spread quickly, and soon half the town appeared to welcome them back. The doctor examined Tanner's leg and pronounced it healing well, though he would need to stay off it for another few weeks. "He can stay in my room," Penelope announced. "I will take care of him." There was some murmuring about propriety, but Mrs. Chen spoke up loudly. "The man installed windows for her, and then nearly died in the mountains. She can nurse him back to health. Anyone has a problem with that can answer to me." So Tanner moved into Penelope's room above the general store. She made a pallet on the floor for herself and insisted he take the bed. During the day she worked on her sewing while he rested, and in the evenings they would sit by the windows and talk. "I should have sent word somehow," Tanner said. "I knew you would worry. You should have. But I understand why you could not." She set down her stitching and moved to sit beside him on the bed. "Tanner, when I thought I might have lost you, I realized something. I do not want to spend another day apart from you. Life is too short and too uncertain." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I told you before I left that I was going to ask you to marry me. And I am telling you now that my answer is yes. It was always going to be yes. Tanner reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather cord. Strung on it was a simple gold band. This was my mother's. It is all I have left of her. I have been carrying it, waiting for the right moment. He slipped the ring off the cord and held it up. Penelope Durrant, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making sure you always have light? Yes, she whispered, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town. Tanner stood at the altar in one of the shirts Penelope had made for him, his legs still healing but steady. Penelope wore a simple cream dress she had stitched herself, working by the light of the windows he had given her. Mrs. Chen cried through the whole ceremony. Old Tom gave Penelope away. Half the town crammed into the church to watch the mountain man, and the seamstress pledge their lives to each other. When the preacher said Tanner could kiss his bride, he cupped Penelope's face in his large, calloused hands and kissed her with such tenderness that there was not a dry eye in the building. After the wedding, there was a party in the street outside the church. Someone brought out a fiddle, and there was dancing and food and far too much whiskey. Tanner pulled Penelope close and they swayed together, not really following the music, just holding each other. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "About leaving town and coming to live in my cabin?" "It will be hard living, especially compared to this. I am sure. Anywhere with you is home." That night, after the party wound down, they rode together to the cabin under a sky full of stars. Tanner had prepared for this, had cleaned and organized, had even brought up proper furniture he had made himself. But the best surprise was waiting for Penelope inside. He had installed windows, 4 large ones, facing all directions, so that light would pour in from sunrise to sunset. The cabin that had once been dark was now bright and airy, and Penelope burst into tears the moment she saw them. "You said you loved the light," Tanner said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I wanted to make sure you would have it here too." She turned in his arms and kissed him. "I love you. I love you so much." He carried her to the bed, and that night they came together as husband and wife, learning each other in the gentle light of the moon streaming through the windows. Tanner was patient and tender, treating Penelope like she was something infinitely precious. And Penelope discovered that love could feel like sunlight, warming you from the inside out. The next morning, Penelope woke in Tanner's arms, sunshine streaming across their bed. She lay still, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. This was her life now, mountains and fresh air and a man who loved her enough to bring light into darkness. The first winter in the cabin was hard but beautiful. Snow piled high around them, and sometimes they would be snowed in for days at a time. But they had each other, and the cabin was warm and bright even in the darkest months. Tanner taught Penelope to shoot, to track game, to read the weather in the sky. Penelope taught him to appreciate small comforts, good food, soft blankets, flowers on the table even in winter. She continued her sewing, taking on projects when people from town sent word up. Tanner built her a proper workroom with huge windows and a sturdy table. On clear days, she would sit and stitch while he went out to check his trap lines, and when he returned, she would have a hot meal waiting. They learned each other's rhythms and moods. They argued sometimes about small things, but they always worked it out. Tanner was stubborn but fair, and Penelope was good at making her points clearly. They were partners in the truest sense, each contributing what they could to make their life work. Spring came, and with it a surprise. Penelope missed her monthly courses and began feeling ill in the mornings. Mrs. Chen, who had ridden up to visit and bring supplies, took one look at her and laughed. "You are with child, dear girl." Penelope's hands flew to her belly. "A baby." She was going to have Tanner's baby. When she told him that evening, Tanner went very still. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." "Penelope, I never thought I would have this. A wife, a child, a real family again. I am more than happy. I am blessed." Over the following months, as Penelope's belly grew round, Tanner built a cradle from smooth pine and carved it with intricate designs, birds and flowers and mountains. He expanded the cabin, adding another room for the baby. He hunted and trapped with renewed purpose, building up their stores, determined to provide for his growing family. Penelope sewed tiny clothes, her heart full of joy and terror in equal measure. Giving birth in the mountains was risky, but Mrs. Chen had promised to come when the time arrived, and Tanner had already worked out the fastest route to bring the doctor from town if needed. The baby came on a cool October morning, just as the aspens were turning gold. Tanner had fetched Mrs. Chen 2 days earlier when Penelope's pain started, and the old woman coached her through the long hours of labor. Tanner stayed by Penelope's side the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her face with a cool cloth, whispering encouragement. When their son finally arrived, squalling and red-faced, Tanner wept openly. "He is perfect," he kept saying. "You are perfect. Thank you. Thank you." They named him Thomas after Penelope's father, with the middle name James after Tanner's own father. Little Thomas had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and he was loved beyond measure. Watching Tanner with their son made Penelope fall in love with him all over again. This huge, strong man was so incredibly gentle with the baby, cradling Thomas in his massive arms as if he might break. He would sit by the window in the rocking chair he had made and sing old songs in his deep voice while the baby slept against his chest. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy, following his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive in the mountains. Penelope had 2 more children, a daughter named Mary and another son they called Daniel. The cabin expanded again and again to hold their growing family. Through it all, Tanner made sure Penelope always had light. He maintained the windows meticulously, cleaned them until they sparkled, positioned the house so that sun would stream through at all hours. And Penelope made sure their home was filled with warmth and comfort, with good food and soft quilts and the laughter of children. They went to town several times a year, and people would shake their heads in wonder at how happy they looked. The mountain man and the seamstress who had found each other in the dark and built a life in the light. Old Tom passed away when Thomas was 5, and they attended his funeral in Carlin. Mrs. Chen continued to visit them regularly, bringing news from town and supplies they could not make themselves. She became honorary grandmother to their children, and she would sit by the fire in the evenings, holding a baby and smiling at the life Penelope and Tanner had built. "I knew from the start you 2 were meant for each other," she would say. "The moment he started installing those windows, I knew." On their 10th anniversary, Tanner took Penelope back to the meadow where he had first kissed her. They left the children with Mrs. Chen and rode out on a perfect summer day. The meadow was just as beautiful as Penelope remembered, full of wildflowers swaying in the breeze. They spread out a blanket and lay side by side, holding hands, watching clouds drift across the endless blue sky. "You ever regret it?" Tanner asked. "Giving up town life, living out here in the wilderness?" Penelope rolled onto her side to look at him. His hair was longer now, streaked with a bit of gray at the temples. The years had added lines around his eyes, but he was still the strongest, most handsome man she had ever seen. And more than that, he was good and kind and true. "Not for a single moment," she said. You gave me light, Tanner. Not just with the windows, but in every way that matters. You saw me when I was invisible. You cared when no one else did. You loved me enough to change my entire world. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. You changed my world too. I was just surviving before you, moving through the days. You gave me a reason to live again. You and our children, you are everything. They stayed in the meadow until sunset, talking about everything and nothing, remembering how far they had come from that dark room above the general store. The children grew. Thomas became a skilled hunter like his father, but he also had his mother's eye for beauty and detail. He would bring home interesting rocks and feathers, arranging them on the windowsills. Mary was quiet and thoughtful, happiest with a book or helping her mother sew. Daniel was the wild one, always climbing trees too tall, exploring caves too deep, giving his parents gray hairs. When Thomas turned 18, he announced he wanted to go to San Francisco to study art. Tanner looked stricken, but Penelope squeezed his hand under the table. "If that is what you want, we will find a way to make it happen," she told their son. They sold pelts and Penelope took on extra sewing work, and by the fall they had enough to send Thomas off with their blessing. It was hard watching him go, but they knew it was right. Children had to find their own paths. Mary met a young man from town, a schoolteacher named William who was kind and patient and loved her fierce intelligence. They married when she was 20, and Penelope cried through the whole ceremony just as Mrs. Chen had cried through hers. Daniel, true to form, decided to join the railroad, working his way up to engineer. He would visit when his routes brought him through Carlin, and he always had exciting stories of distant places. And then it was just Tanner and Penelope again, alone in the cabin that had once been so full of noise and life. But they were not sad. They were proud of the people their children had become, proud of the values they had instilled. "We did well," Tanner said one evening as they sat by the fire. He was in his 50s now, his hair more gray than dark, but still strong, still solid. "We did," Penelope agreed. She was graying too, with lines around her eyes and mouth from a lifetime of smiling. But she felt beautiful still, because Tanner looked at her the same way he had when she was 22. They settled into a new rhythm, just the two of them. They took long walks through the mountains, revisiting favorite spots. They sat by the windows and talked for hours. They made love in the sunlight that still poured through the glass, slower and gentler now, but no less sweet. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83. At her funeral, she left a letter for Penelope that made her cry and laugh at the same time. It read, "I knew you would be happy. I knew the mountain man would take care of you. Love is sometimes quiet, like building windows for someone who needs light. Remember that. Remember to always let the light in." More years passed. Thomas became a successful painter in San Francisco, and they were so proud when they saw his work displayed in galleries. Mary and William had 4 children who would visit in the summers, running wild through the mountains. Daniel rose through the railroad ranks and sent money home that Tanner and Penelope did not need but appreciated for the thought behind it. The cabin that Tanner had built with his own hands stood strong through storms and snow and blistering summer heat. The windows he had installed decades ago still let in perfect light, though he had replaced the glass a few times over the years. On their 30th anniversary, Tanner presented Penelope with a gift, a quilt frame he had built, positioned directly under the largest window. "So you can see every stitch," he said. Penelope hugged him tight. "After all these years, you are still finding ways to give me light." "Always," he promised. When Tanner was 60, he took a bad fall while hunting. His leg, the same one that had been broken decades before, shattered again. This time it did not heal as well. He walked with a cane after that, and the long trap lines were too much for him. But he did not complain. He focused on woodworking, creating beautiful pieces that Daniel would sell for him in the cities along his railroad route. Penelope's hands grew stiff with age, making sewing difficult. But she still stitched, slowly and carefully, creating quilts for her grandchildren, embroidering handkerchiefs for special occasions. And she still sat by the windows, still treasured the light. They grew old together, these two people who had found each other in the dark. Their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, refined by time and hardship into something unbreakable. On a spring morning when Tanner was 70 and Penelope was 68, they sat together on the porch he had built years ago. It faced east, catching the sunrise, and they held hands as they watched the light spill over the mountains. "I need to tell you something," Tanner said, his voice still deep but softer now with age. Penelope looked at him, at the face she knew better than her own. "That day I walked into your dark room, I knew," he continued. "I knew you were going to change everything. I tried to tell myself I was just helping someone who needed it, but the truth is, I was falling in love with you from that very first moment." "I knew too," Penelope said softly. "When you asked how I could work in the dark, I heard the real question: how could anyone let you? And I realized no one had asked me that before. No one had cared enough to see me struggling. I cared, I care, I will always care. I know, and I will always love you for it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up around them. Birds sang in the pines. A deer stepped delicately through the clearing. The sun climbed higher, warming their old bones. "Do you remember when you told me you used to live in the dark?" Penelope asked. "After your family died," Tanner nodded. "You said it nearly drove you mad. But then you brought light into my life, and in doing so, you saved us both." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "Yes, we did." The grandchildren visited that summer, a whole noisy crew of them, and the cabin that had been so quiet rang with laughter again. Tanner and Penelope sat on the porch and watched them play, climbing trees and splashing in the stream. "We made this," Penelope said, gesturing to the children. "All of this. From two broken people working in the dark, we made light and life and love." Tanner squeezed her hand. "Best thing I ever built was us." One cool October morning, Tanner did not wake up. Penelope found him peaceful in their bed, the sunrise just beginning to glow through the window. He looked young somehow, the lines smoothed from his face, and there was the hint of a smile on his lips. She sat beside him and held his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for the light. Thank you for loving me so well." They buried him on a hillside overlooking the cabin with a view of the mountains he had loved. The whole family came. Thomas from San Francisco, Mary and her family, Daniel taking time off from the railroad. And people from Carlin came too, people who remembered the story of the mountain man and the seamstress. After the funeral, Penelope's children tried to convince her to come live in town or with one of them, but she refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Your father built it for us. I am not leaving." So she stayed in the cabin, and the children took turns visiting, making sure she was never alone for too long. Thomas painted a portrait of Tanner from memory and hung it above the fireplace, and Penelope would talk to it sometimes, telling him about her day. She kept the windows spotlessly clean, just as he had always done. She sat in the sunlight and sewed, though her hands were slow and her eyes were failing. She made one final quilt, a masterpiece that told their story in fabric. A dark room, windows being installed, mountains and meadows, a growing family. When it was finished, she gave it to Mary to keep for the generations to come. Penelope lived 4 more years after Tanner died. They were lonely years, but not unhappy ones. She had her memories, and she had the light he had given her. Every morning she would wake to sunshine streaming through the windows and feel grateful for one more day in the home they had built together. On a spring morning very much like the one when Tanner had passed, Penelope woke to brilliant light flooding the room. But this light was different, warmer and brighter than any sunrise. And standing in it, looking just as he had when they first met, was Tanner. He smiled and held out his hand. "Ready to come home?" Penelope, young again, her hands smooth and strong, her eyes bright, took his hand without hesitation. "I am ready." They found her peaceful in their bed, the morning sun on her face, a smile on her lips. And in her hand, clutched tight even in death, was the leather cord that had once held her wedding ring, worn smooth from decades of him carrying it close to his heart. Mary and her children cleaned out the cabin, deciding to keep it in the family, a place where future generations could visit and remember the love story that started it all. The windows remained, still bringing light into the rooms where Tanner and Penelope had built their life. Above the mantel, beside Thomas's painting of their father, they hung one of their mother. In it, she sat by a window sewing with light pouring over her. She was smiling, and if you looked closely, you could see reflected in the window glass the shadow of a large man standing behind her, watching over her as he always had. Years turned to decades. The cabin remained standing, maintained by the family who would never forget the story of how it came to be. They would tell their children and their children's children about the seamstress who worked in the dark, until a mountain man built her windows to let the sunlight in. About how sometimes love is not fireworks and grand gestures, but someone caring enough to notice you struggling and doing something about it. The town of Carlin changed too, growing and modernizing. The railroad that had given it life continued to run, though the silver mines eventually played out. But people still remembered the stories, still spoke of the old days. And when they did, they always mentioned the mountain man and the seamstress whose love story had become legend. Thomas's paintings hung in galleries across the country, many of them depicting mountain scenes and lights streaming through windows. He would say in interviews that his parents taught him to really see light, to understand how it could transform darkness, how it was not just about illumination but about hope and love. Mary became a teacher, and she would tell her students about her parents on the first day of school every year. "My father once told me that when you love someone, you pay attention to what they need, even if they have not said it out loud. My mother worked in the dark, so he brought her light. That is what love does. It sees and it acts." Daniel named his first daughter Penelope and his first son Tanner, and he would take them to the cabin every summer so they could run through the same meadows their great-grandparents had walked through decades before. The legacy of Tanner and Penelope Frost lived on, not just in their descendants, but in the simple truth they had lived. That love is sometimes quiet and practical, that it shows itself in windows installed and meals cooked and hands held through long years. That the greatest romance is not always the loudest or flashiest, but the one that endures, the one that brings light into darkness and keeps it burning steady through all the years. In the cabin on the hillside, sunshine still poured through the windows Tanner built with his own hands. And if you visited on a quiet morning standing in that light, you could almost feel them there still. The mountain man and his seamstress, forever young, forever in love, forever bathed in the light they had given each other. The story of Tanner and Penelope became part of the fabric of Carlin, Nevada, woven into its history as surely as the threads Penelope had once stitched in the dark. The general store where she had lived above was eventually torn down to make way for progress, but a plaque was placed on the new building, telling her story. Every year on the anniversary of Tanner installing those first windows, the town held a small celebration, reminding themselves that sometimes the best love stories are not about princes and princesses, but about real people who see each other truly and choose to build something beautiful together. And high in the Ruby Mountains, in a cabin full of windows and light, their love remained as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves, a testament to the simple truth that love, real love, is about giving someone exactly what they need, even if they never thought to ask for it. It is about seeing someone working in the dark and deciding that is not acceptable, that they deserve better, that you will be the one to bring them light. That is how the story ended and how it lived on, in windows and sunlight, in children and grandchildren, in paintings and quilts, in a town that never forgot, and in the hearts of all who heard it and understood that sometimes the most profound love is the simplest. Noticing someone struggling and caring enough to help, then spending the rest of your life making sure they never have to struggle alone again.